The day the Korean Mafia boss lost everything. No one stayed. Not his guards. Not his advisors. Not even the people who owed him their lives. By morning, his accounts were frozen, his assets flagged, and his house turned into a cage he couldn't leave. But when he walked into his kitchen, someone was still there. Calm. Unbothered. Cooking like nothing had changed. And when he looked closer, he realized two things at once. She was hiding something. And whatever it was the reason she couldn't leave. The morning the empire fell, the silence was louder than any gunshot. Roman stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his master bedroom, his hands gripped tight behind his back. Outside, the long driveway of his Gwangram City estate was crowded with black SUVs and tow trucks. One by one, his custom Italian sports cars were being pulled away. The federal agents moved like vultures, tagging everything he owned with bright yellow stickers. They hadn't kicked him out yet, but they had turned his mansion into a cage. He was under house arrest, a king with no kingdom and nowhere to go. He watched through the glass as the last of his security team drove away. They didn't look back. They didn't want to be caught in the legal mess that was swallowing his life. Even the people who had sworn their lives to him a week ago were gone the moment the bank accounts were frozen. The power, the fear, and the respect he had built as the city's most feared boss had vanished overnight. Now, he was just a man in a very large, very empty house. He walked through the marble hallways, and the sound of his own footsteps felt like a ghost following him. Every room was a reminder of what he had lost. The air felt thin and cold. He made his way toward the grand staircase, expecting to find the kitchen empty like the rest of the house. He figured the chef and the cleaners had run off hours ago. But as he reached the bottom floor, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It was a steady, rhythmic noise coming from the back of the house. Thump. 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 It was the sound of a sharp knife hitting a wooden cutting board. Roman frowned. His hand instinctively reached for the gun he no longer carried. He moved toward the kitchen, his heart beating fast against his ribs. When he stepped through the door, he froze. The kitchen was bright and smelled like fresh ginger and simmering broth. Danae, his household operations manager, was standing at the center island. She wasn't just staff, she handled contracts, schedules, and the kind of details his lawyers often missed. She was wearing a simple cream-colored wrap, her dark curls pulled back loosely at the nape of her neck. A few escaped around her face from the warmth of the stove. She looked exactly as she always did, composed, unhurried, and completely unreadable. She didn't look up as he entered. She just kept slicing vegetables with perfect focus, her movements calm and sure. The world outside was ending, his life was over, and yet here she was, acting like it was just another Tuesday. Roman stared at her, confused and a little angry. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Everyone else is gone. The money is gone, Danae." She stopped cutting for a second but kept her eyes on the board. She didn't look scared or desperate. Then, she shifted her weight, and she moved with a strange, careful slowness that Roman had never seen before. Her hand drifted down to touch her stomach for just a split second before she went back to her work. Roman's eyes narrowed as he watched her. Something was very wrong, and as he looked at her again, he realized she wasn't just staying for the job. Roman walked further into the kitchen, his shadow stretching across the cold floor. He felt like a stranger in his own home. He waited for Danae to look up, to cry, or to ask for the money he didn't have. Usually, people bowed when he entered a room, but she didn't even flinch. He gripped the edge of the marble counter, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to feel like the powerful boss again, the man who could move mountains with a single word. Instead, he felt invisible. He watched her hands move quickly, and he noticed she was using the small, old vegetables from the back of the pantry. She wasn't using the fancy imports he usually ordered. She was making do with what was left. "I told you the staff is dismissed," Roman said, his voice deep and sharp. "There is no paycheck coming." My accounts are locked by the feds. If you stay, you're working for a man who has nothing. Danae glanced at him briefly. Then you should start with something simple. She slid a cutting board toward him. You can chop. He expected her to drop the knife and leave. He expected her to realize that the great Roman was now just a prisoner in a house he couldn't afford to heat. But Danae didn't stop. She poured hot water into a cup, the steam rising around her face like a soft cloud. She pushed the cup toward him across the counter. The tea is ready, she said quietly. You haven't slept, and your hands are shaking. You should drink this. Her calm voice felt like a slap to his ego. It bothered him that she wasn't panicking. He realized that while he had been staring out the window at his dying empire, she had been quietly making sure the house didn't fall apart. This was a new kind of power, one that didn't come from guns or money. It was the power of being the only one who knew where the keys were kept. He took a sip of the tea, and the warmth felt strange in his chest. As he looked at her, he wondered why a smart woman would stay in a house that was legally a crime scene. She was too calm, and her eyes were too observant. He watched her carefully as she reached for a heavy pot on a high shelf. Usually, she was quick and light on her feet, but today she moved with a heavy, protective grace. She winced slightly as she stretched her arms, and she placed one hand on the small of her back. Roman stepped forward to help, but he stopped himself. He saw a small slip of paper fall out of her pocket. It looked like a receipt from a local clinic, one far away from Gwangram City. Before he could reach for it, Danae quickly stepped on it, hiding it under her shoe. She looked him right in the eye, and for the first time, Roman saw a flash of fear. It wasn't fear of him or the feds. It was the fear of a woman with a secret that was growing every day. He realized then that Danae wasn't just staying to help him, she was hiding something that might be more dangerous than his legal troubles. The front doorbell rang like a funeral bell, echoing through the empty halls. A man in a cheap suit stood there holding a tablet and a roll of bright yellow stickers. He was the court auditor, sent to mark everything Roman owned for the upcoming auction. Roman stood in the foyer, his jaw tight as the man began tagging his hand-carved desk and the expensive paintings on the walls. It was a slow, public death. Each sticker felt like a brand on Roman's skin, a sign that the Korean Mafia boss no longer owned even the chair he sat on. The auditor smirked, clearly enjoying the sight of a powerful man losing his grip. He moved toward a glass case holding Roman's collection of ancient coins, but before he could touch it, Danae stepped into the room. She didn't raise her voice, but the air seemed to grow cold around her. She held a thick folder full of papers and looked the auditor up and down with a chilling look. According to the Section 4B emergency stay, she said, her voice like ice, items essential for daily living and personal health cannot be seized during the first 30 days of an injunction. The auditor laughed, but it died in his throat when she shoved a page under his nose. She pointed to a specific line of fine print that Roman's own expensive lawyers had never mentioned before they ran away. Danae began listing items, the kitchen equipment, the master bedroom furniture, and even the heavy safe in the library, as essential tools for household management. She wasn't just working, she was fighting a war with paperwork, and she was winning. Roman watched her, his heart thumping against his ribs. He had always seen her as a quiet background character, someone who just made sure the floors were clean. Now, he saw a woman who understood the law better than a judge. As she backed the auditor into a corner, Roman noticed she was breathing heavily. She kept one hand tucked behind her back, pressing it against her spine as if she were in pain. The mystery of her staying grew deeper. Why would a woman with this much intelligence waste it on a sinking ship? He stepped closer, intending to ask her where she had learned to talk like a lawyer, but he stopped when he saw her face go pale. The auditor finally sighed and stomped out of the room to call his office, leaving them alone in the hallway. Danae leaned against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut for a moment. She looked exhausted, but she gripped her folder like a shield. Roman reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder, but he didn't touch her. He noticed a small smudge of ink on her thumb and a stack of mail in her bag that wasn't addressed to the house. It was addressed to a private box under a name he didn't recognize. Just as his fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, Danae's hand came down hard over her bag, pulling it against her body. She looked at him, not with the fear of a woman caught, but with the steady, warning eyes of a woman who had been caught before and survived it. Roman pulled his hand back slowly. "Who are you really, Danae?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She said nothing. She turned back to the hallway and began walking, her footsteps quiet and even, as if the question had never been asked at all. Roman stood in the hallway long after she had gone, his question still hanging in the cold air unanswered. He had built an empire on knowing everything about everyone around him, and yet the woman who had stayed when no one else would was a complete stranger. He was still turning that thought over when the basement groaned, a long, mechanical death rattle, and the heat died all at once. The dark living room filled with cold so fast it felt deliberate. Roman stood in the center of it, his breath turning to mist, and realized the silence of his unanswered question had just been swallowed by a bigger problem. Outside, the streetlights flickered, but inside, the luxury was rotting. Without his black cards, the gourmet food trucks had stopped coming, and the power company had finally cut the main line. Roman felt small, his expensive silk shirt offering no protection against the winter chill. He was used to ordering people to fix his problems, but now there was no one left to call. He found Danae in the kitchen, lighting a small camping stove she must have pulled from an emergency kit he didn't even know existed. She was wrapped in a thick wool blanket, her face pale but determined. "The main pantry is locked by the court seal, but the basement root cellar isn't," Danae said, her voice steady despite the cold. She handed him a heavy flashlight. "I need you to help me move the water jugs." "I don't carry things," Roman muttered. Danae didn't look up. "You do now. We have to keep them near the stove so they don't freeze." Roman hesitated, his ego stinging at the thought of doing manual labor. He was the boss of Gwangram City, a man who dealt in millions, not plastic jugs of water. But when he looked at Danae, he saw her wince as she tried to lift a crate of canned goods. Her face twisted in a brief moment of pain, and she leaned heavily against the counter. For the first time, Roman didn't see a servant, he saw a partner in a sinking ship. He grabbed the flashlight and the heavy crate, his muscles straining. It was a strange feeling to work alongside her, their shoulders brushing in the tight space of the pantry. As they worked, the silence between them changed. It wasn't the silence of a boss and an employee anymore, it was the quiet of two people in a war zone. Roman watched how she organized their tiny hoard of food with a sharp, tactical mind. When they moved into the root cellar to shift the water jugs, Danae stopped him at the far door, a low wooden panel half hidden behind a shelf of old preserves. "I'll handle that section," she said, and her voice carried no room for argument. Roman looked at the door and then at her. He let it go. He had bigger things to worry about. But he did not forget it. She was navigating this collapse like a general. "Where did you learn to survive like this?" Roman asked, his voice softer than usual. Danae didn't answer right away. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn map of the city with certain medical clinics circled in red ink. She stared at it for a second before folding it tightly. "When you grow up with nothing, you learn that everything can disappear in an hour," she replied, looking at him with a gaze that felt far too old for her face. By the time they finished, a small fire was crackling in the kitchen hearth. They sat near the flames, the orange light dancing on the walls. Roman noticed Danae was staring at the back door, her body tense and ready to run. He realized that the survival mode she was in wasn't just about food or heat. She was hiding from something much closer than the feds. Suddenly the small fire in the hearth threw a long wave of orange light across the kitchen wall, and in that glow Roman caught movement through the window, a shadow passing low and fast along the outside wall, there for a second and then gone. Danae's hand flew to her stomach. Roman was already moving. He grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and crossed the hallway in silence, taking the stairs two at a time. The upstairs corridor was dark and still. The window at the far end had a long crack running through the glass, from the cold, or from something else, he couldn't tell. But on the floor beneath it were two muddy boot prints that stopped at the sill and did not continue. Someone had stood at that window and watched the firelight below. And then they had left. Roman stood very still for a long moment. Then he went back downstairs and said nothing. He simply set the poker against the wall within arm's reach and sat back down beside the fire. Danae watched his face and did not ask. The way he looked at the back door told her everything. Neither of them slept. By the time a gray light crept under the kitchen door, Roman and Danae had moved to the small library without discussing it, simply because it was the room farthest from that upstairs window, and the only one where the fireplace still worked. As Roman tossed a broken wooden chair into the flames to keep the fire going, he found himself watching Danae's reflection in the dark windows. His mind drifted back to a rainy night 4 months ago. He had been in the middle of a brutal war with a rival gang, and his nerves were frayed like an old rope. That night, he had found Danae in this very room, and for a few hours, the coldness of his life as a Mafia boss had disappeared. He had treated that moment like a temporary escape, a quick way to forget the blood on his hands. To him, it was just a brief release from the stress of being a leader. He had never spoken of it again, going back to his role as the distant, icy boss the very next morning. In the present, the firelight showed him things he had been too distracted to see before. Danae was busy scrubbing the soot off the hearth, but she was using only plain water and a rag. She had pushed away the strong cleaning sprays, her face turning pale just from the faint scent of the old chemicals. Roman noticed the way she stood up, moving with a slow, careful balance as if she were carrying something fragile made of glass. When she walked toward the corner to stack the wood, her gait was wider and more grounded than it used to be. He realized he didn't know this woman at all, even though she had been the one person to stay by his side when the world took everything else away. As she leaned forward to stack the firewood, her sleeve slid back past her wrist and Roman caught a glimpse of a small faded tattoo, a symbol he almost recognized. It nagged at the back of his mind the way a half-remembered name does. He had seen that mark somewhere before. He couldn't place it, and before he could look closer she had pushed her sleeve back down and straightened up. He filed it away and said nothing. The guilt of his past dismissal began to burn in his chest, sharper than the cold air. He stepped toward her, reaching out to take the heavy water bucket from her hands. "You should sit down," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl that was surprisingly gentle. "You're not used to giving helpful advice," Danae said quietly. "I'm adapting," Roman replied. "Slowly," she said. "The air is thin, and you've done enough today." Danae pulled back, her eyes flashing with a mix of pride and something that looked like old hurt. "I don't need your pity, Roman. I am doing my job," she replied, but her voice trailed off as a wave of dizziness seemed to hit her. She sat down abruptly on the edge of a faded armchair, her hand instinctively resting over her midsection. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire, but the tension between them was pulling tighter, closing the distance that had existed for months. Roman knelt down to stoke the fire, his eyes fixed on the way she protected her stomach with both arms. He felt a strange, nagging thought at the back of his mind, a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. He reached for a discarded newspaper to use as kindling, but his hand stopped when he saw a set of handwritten notes tucked into the side of the chair. It wasn't a hit list. The names were paired with times and locations, written with careful precision. Roman frowned. This wasn't someone planning attacks. This was someone tracking movement. She wasn't hunting them. She was keeping track of who was watching her. Before he could ask her why she was tracking his rivals, the heavy front door groaned on its hinges. It wasn't the feds, and it wasn't a gust of wind. A low, familiar whistle echoed through the hallway, a signal used by the very man on her list. Danae's face went completely white as she looked at the door, and Roman realized she wasn't just hiding a secret from him, she was the reason the enemy knew exactly where they were trapped. The sound of the whistle was followed by the sharp crack of a window breaking in the dining room. Roman didn't stop to think. He grabbed Danae's arm and pulled her toward the hidden door behind the library bookshelves. Danae didn't resist, she hooked her bag over her shoulder in one practiced motion without breaking stride, the way someone moves when they have spent a long time never letting it leave their side. The panic room was a cold, steel box, but it was the only place left in the mansion that still felt like a fortress. Once the heavy door clicked shut, the world outside went silent. Roman stood in the center of the small room, his chest heaving as he listened to the muffled thuds of men moving through his home. He looked at Danae, expecting her to be looking at the security monitors, but she was huddled in the corner. She was sitting on a pile of old blankets, her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped tightly around her middle. She wasn't watching the door, she was focused entirely on the life she was guarding. The red emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows across them. Roman realized that his power as a mafia boss meant nothing in this tiny room. He couldn't protect her with money or men anymore. He knelt in front of her, his gaze softening as he saw her trembling. "The glass is thick, Danae. They can't get in here," he whispered, reaching out to steady her. As he moved a blanket to cover her shoulders, a small plastic bottle rolled out of her bag and clattered across the metal floor. Roman picked it up. The label was for prenatal vitamins, and the name on the bottle was hers. He turned the bottle over, his jaw tightening. It looked simple, but something about it didn't feel finished, like it wasn't the only way she was being tracked. He looked from the pills to the way she held herself, her hands never leaving her stomach. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The illness she had been hiding and the way she moved so carefully all made sense now. She wasn't just a worker who stayed behind, she was a woman carrying a secret that changed everything about his collapse. "How long?" Roman asked, his voice barely a whisper. The anger he usually felt was gone, replaced by a strange, heavy weight in his heart. Danae finally looked up at him, her eyes wet with tears but still full of that same stubborn pride. "Long enough to know that I can't let them find me," she replied. She didn't say it was his, but she didn't have to. The memory of that rainy night 4 months ago flashed in his mind, no longer a forgotten moment but a permanent tie. Their relationship, which had always been about orders and silence, was suddenly stripped down to its rawest form. He wasn't her boss anymore, and she wasn't his manager. They were just two people trapped in a cage with a future they hadn't planned for. Just then, the security monitor on the wall flickered to life. The men outside weren't just searching for jewelry or cash. One of them held up a photo to a camera lens, a grainy picture of Danae leaving a clinic. He began to speak into a radio, his voice crackling through the panic room speakers. "She's in here somewhere. The boss wants the girl and whatever she's carrying. We don't need him. Just secure the girl." Roman felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. He looked at the list of names he had found earlier and realized the truth. Danae wasn't tracking his enemies to help them, she was tracking them because she knew they were hunting her. As the sound of a heavy drill began to grind against the steel door, Roman realized he had only minutes to figure out who had betrayed her location, and his eyes landed on the small GPS tracker blinking inside the very vitamin bottle he was holding. The grinding sound of the drill outside the panic room stopped, replaced by a heavy, ringing silence. Roman stared at the small bottle in his hand, his thumb brushing over the blinking GPS light hidden in the cap. The timeline burned through his mind like a fuse. 4 months since that rainy night. 4 months of him being a cold, distant boss while Danae carried the weight of the world alone. The realization hit him harder than any police raid ever could. This wasn't just a household employee who stayed out of habit. She was carrying his child, the only piece of his legacy that hadn't been seized by the government or stolen by his enemies. He looked at her huddled on the floor, and for the first time in his life, the Korean mafia boss felt a fear that had nothing to do with death. He realized that every time he had barked an order at her or ignored her presence, he had been pushing away the only thing that actually mattered. The dim red light made the room feel small and suffocating. Roman didn't shout or demand an explanation. Instead, he sat down on the cold metal floor across from her, his long legs folded. The silence between them was heavy with the truth. He looked at the ruins of his life, the empty mansion above them, his frozen bank accounts, and his lost reputation, and then he looked at Danae. She was pale and exhausted, but her eyes held a fierce strength that made his former power look like a joke. He realized that control wasn't about having 1,000 men ready to fight for him. True control was what Danae had been doing, surviving, planning, and protecting a life in the middle of a war zone. He reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he moved to touch her arm, but he stopped just short of her skin. The gap between them was filled with months of his own neglect. "You knew," Roman said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You knew even before the feds showed up at the door." Danae finally met his gaze, her jaw set in a hard line. "I knew you would see it as a problem to be solved, Roman. I didn't want to be another item on your to-do list." Her words stung more than any betrayal. He had spent years treating people like assets, and now he was seeing the cost. He looked back at the GPS tracker in the vitamin bottle. It was a high-tech piece of equipment, much too expensive for a common thief. It was a tracker used by the internal security team of his own former organization. He realized that someone he had trusted had planted this on her weeks ago, watching her every move and waiting for him to fall so they could take what was his. As they sat in the quiet, a soft, electronic beep came from the wall panel. It wasn't an alarm from the men outside. It was an incoming message on a private, encrypted line that only Roman's inner circle used. The message was a single photo, a picture of Danae's childhood home in a small village, surrounded by men in black suits. Roman felt a cold rage settle into his bones. The mystery of why the rival gang was so focused on her was finally becoming clear, but it was worse than he thought. They weren't just after his heir. They were using her past as leverage, proof that she had been inside his operation long enough to know everything worth knowing. Just then, a secret compartment in the floor of the panic room, one Roman hadn't even told his architects about, began to slide open from the outside. Someone knew every single secret of this house, and they were already inside the room with them. The secret floor hatch stopped moving, revealing a dark crawl space. Roman stepped in front of Danae, his body a shield, but no one climbed out. Instead, a small, black radio sat on the top step, hissing with static. Roman realized the intruder wasn't coming through the floor, they were using the house's old servant tunnels to watch them. He turned to Danae, his mind racing to find a way to control the chaos. "I have a small cabin near the northern coast," he said, his voice coming out in quick, sharp bursts. "The deed is in a fake name. I can get you there tonight. I can manage this, Danae. I can fix it." He reached for his old leather notebook, already planning the logistics, trying to be the boss who moved people around like chess pieces. He wanted to solve her like a problem because that was the only way he knew how to show he cared. But Danae didn't move toward the hatch. She didn't look relieved or grateful. She stayed sitting on the floor, her hands folded over her stomach, looking at him with a tired, honest expression that made him feel smaller than the cold room. "Stop it, Roman," she said, and for the first time, her voice wasn't quiet or polite. It was strong and sharp. "You keep talking about safe houses and plans as if you are still the king of Gwangram City. You aren't. You are a man under house arrest with no friends left." Roman flinched as if she had hit him. He tried to argue, to tell her he still had power, but she cut him off. "I stayed because this house has bulletproof glass and a generator. I stayed because I have no money and nowhere else to go that is safe for a child. I didn't stay for you, Roman. I stayed for the baby." The words felt like a heavy weight dropping onto his chest. He had spent weeks thinking her presence was a sign of loyalty or a hidden love, but it was just survival. His heart, which had been a hard stone for years, finally began to crack. He realized he had been so busy being a boss that he had never bothered to be a man worth staying for. The pride he had carried his whole life suddenly felt empty and useless. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the dark circles under her eyes and the way her fingers trembled against her dress. He wasn't her hero, he was just a man with a sturdy house. The relationship they had built on silence was finally breaking open, revealing a painful truth that he couldn't ignore anymore. The radio on the floor chirped again, but this time the voice was clear. It was Roman's former right-hand man, the one who had disappeared the night of the raid. The hatch was just a gift, boss, the voice laughed. A reminder that I know every inch of that cage. I don't want the house. I want the file she's holding, the one tied to your last hidden accounts. Roman said nothing. But his mind had already locked onto one word. The hatch. His right-hand man had just referenced the panic room's hidden floor compartment, a detail that existed in no architectural drawing Roman had ever filed. The only people who could have known it existed were the ones who had access to the sealed court inventory taken by the federal agents on day one. The cold that settled into Roman's chest had nothing to do with the broken heating. Roman looked at Danae, and the piece he had been missing finally locked into place. His right-hand man had not helped Danae out of loyalty. He had helped her hide the financial files because he believed she was the only one who knew where they led. He had been patient, waiting for Roman's empire to fall so he could step in and take the accounts for himself. Danae hadn't trusted him. She had simply been using the same man who thought he was using her. And now his patience had run out. The 10 seconds passed in a heartbeat, but Roman didn't reach for the radio to surrender. Instead, he looked at Danae, seeing her not as an employee or a secret to keep, but as the only real thing left in his life. The heavy thumping upstairs increased, and he knew his former right-hand man was tearing the library apart to find them. Roman reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive, the one thing he had hidden from the feds and his enemies alike. It contained the evidence that could clear his name, but it also held the key to his freedom. He looked at the drive and then at Danae. For the first time, he didn't care about his empire or his future. He cared about the woman who had used her own sharp mind to survive when he was too busy sulking over his lost throne. He moved toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, and handed her the drive. "You said you stayed for the baby," Roman whispered, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "Then take this." He held out the drive. "It has everything, every account, every transaction, every name. Including mine. Including theirs." He paused. "If I use it, I have to testify. And testimony means your name comes out. Your history with the firm. Everything you've been protecting gets exposed in open court." Danae stared at him. "But if you use it," he continued, "you can negotiate your own immunity. Quietly. Without a courtroom. Without anyone ever saying your name out loud." He pressed it into her hand. "I can't clear my name without destroying yours. So I'm not going to." He said it simply, without drama. Like it was the easiest decision he had ever made. Danae stared at the drive, her fingers brushing his as she took it. The touch was brief, but the electricity between them was undeniable. He wasn't giving her an order, he was giving her a choice. Their relationship had shifted from a cold hierarchy to a desperate, shared sacrifice. Roman realized that being a boss was easy when you had money, but being a protector required losing everything. He stood up and walked to the radio on the floor. He pressed the channel open and spoke in a voice that was calm and completely controlled. "I'm coming out. Alone. And I have the drive." He looked at Danae as he said it, and she understood immediately, he was not surrendering. He was creating noise. His former right-hand man would move every man he had toward the front of the house. The feds monitoring the property would respond to the movement. For approximately 4 minutes, every set of eyes would be pointed at the wrong door. 4 minutes was enough. He pressed the button on the wall that opened the floor hatch and looked at her. "Go. Now. Don't stop moving until you reach the road behind the north tree line." He held up the drive once more so she could see it clearly. He was the bait. She was the escape. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, the mystery of the betrayal finally reached its peak. Danae grabbed his hand, her eyes searching his. "Why are you doing this now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You could use that drive to save yourself." Roman looked at her wrist, the tattoo he had seen twice now, and said nothing about. He looked at the drive in her hands. He said, quietly, "How long were you reporting to them?" Danae closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were steady. 2 years. I was placed here to locate the hidden accounts. She paused. I stopped reporting 8 months ago. Why? She looked down at her hands over her stomach. Because this was not part of the assignment. And I chose it anyway. Roman was silent for a long moment. They're hunting you because you went dark. Yes. Not because of me. Because of this. She pressed both hands flat against her middle. I disappeared on them. And they do not accept that. Roman nodded slowly. That was the part that had not made sense until now. She was not a traitor. She was a woman who had quietly, completely, chosen a different life, and the people who owned her original one wanted her back. The panic room door groaned as the feds reached the library, and the sound of flashbangs echoed upstairs. Roman pressed a button on the wall, and the secret floor hatch opened wide. Go, he said, his voice a command that sounded more like a plea. He watched her descend into the darkness, but just before she disappeared, she reached up and squeezed his hand. It was the first time she had initiated a touch that wasn't about work or survival. As the feds burst into the room and tackled him to the floor, Roman saw a final message flicker on the security screen. The right-hand man wasn't working for a rival gang, he was working for the same firm whose mark was on Danae's wrist. As the handcuffs tightened around his wrists, Roman realized he hadn't just saved her from his enemies, he might have just handed her back to the people she was truly running from. They kept him in a holding room inside the mansion overnight, a formality before the formal transfer. He sat on a folding chair with his wrists bound and listened to the agents above him pulling the library apart looking for the hatch. They found it just before dawn. By then it no longer mattered. The final morning arrived with a cold, gray light that drained the color from the mansion's marble walls. The 30-day stay was over. Outside, the driveway was no longer filled with luxury cars, but with white government vans and agents with clipboards cataloging the last of what had been his. Roman stood in the foyer as the lead agent stepped forward to take the heavy brass keys. The handcuffs felt heavy on his wrists, a cold weight that marked the end of his life as the boss of Gwangram City. He didn't argue or try to use his name to scare them. Roman walked out of the mansion alone. There was no one left to see him go. The driveway held only government vans and agents with clipboards, cataloging the last of what had been his. He did not look for her. He already knew she was gone. Somewhere beneath the frost-hard ground, through tunnels she had memorized long before he thought to ask why, she was moving. That was enough. The relationship that had started as a cold transaction had ended as a deep, unspoken bond. Roman felt a strange sense of peace as the van door slid shut, blocking out the view of his seized home. He didn't look back at the grand windows or the stone pillars. He had lost his money, his power, and his freedom, but he had built a foundation of trust that no court order could ever take away. He was finally a man who knew what was worth fighting for, even if he had to do it from behind bars. Roman's grip tightened slightly, and then released. He had destroyed the tracker in the vitamin bottle the moment he found it. She had a head start, a clear road, and a drive that could end careers. He had done what he could. He leaned back against the cold wall of the van and let himself breathe for the first time in 30 days. Then he noticed the lead agent beside him lift his phone. On the screen was a live map. A red dot moving steadily away from the estate. It was moving north, not along any road, but in a straight line through the estate's back field. They were tracking the drive itself. Someone had put a second tracker inside it before Roman ever touched it. Roman's stomach dropped. The agent spoke quietly into his radio. Target is moving. Stay on her until she reaches the vault. Roman looked at the dot. He looked at the agent's face, satisfied, unhurried. The face of a man who had been waiting a long time. Roman said nothing for 10 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "You should call them off." The agent smiled without looking at him. "And why would I do that?" "Because the drive she's carrying has audio files on it. 46 hours of them. Conversations from inside this investigation." Roman let that sit for a moment. Including yours. The agent's jaw shifted. The smile did not entirely leave, but it changed shape. Roman turned and looked out the window. She is not going where you think she is going. Roman kept his voice flat. She knew you were watching the cellar. She knew because whoever told you about the hatch told you about the cellar too. And she had already moved everything by then. He did not know this for certain. But he knew Danae. And the agent's jaw tightening told him he was right. The radio in the agent's hand crackled. One of his men, somewhere on a road, saying, "There's nothing here. The address is a grain barn. It's empty." The agent stared at his phone. The red dot had stopped moving. Roman allowed himself one small, quiet exhale. 3 kilometers north of the estate, where the servant tunnel opened into a drainage culvert behind an abandoned fuel depot, Danae climbed out into the gray morning air. A rusted bicycle leaned against the wall exactly where she had left it 4 days earlier. She had planned this the same week the court sealed the pantry. She reached into her bag and took out the encrypted drive. She looked at it for a long moment, at the small embossed symbol on its corner that she had spent 2 years pretending not to recognize. Then she made a phone call. Not to the firm. Not to a lawyer. There was one number she had memorized and never dialed. A journalist who had been building a case against the firm for 11 months and had hit nothing but dead ends and closed doors. She talked for a long time. Roman sat in the back of the government van as it pulled into the detention facility, his wrists cuffed and his empire gone. He had no money, no men, no house, and no name worth using in this city anymore. He had a woman who was smarter than anyone who had come after her. He had a child he had not yet met. And somewhere in a system he had spent his whole life corrupting, he had a drive full of recordings that were about to make a lot of powerful people very uncomfortable. The van door closed. The estate disappeared behind him. Roman leaned his head back against the cold metal wall, closed his eyes, and for the first time in his adult life, smiled. Not because he had won. Because she had.